have Dr. John in this studio from Creation Ministries International. And, of course, Dr. John, you guys have a website, creation.com, where people can go to get thousands of questions answered, mostly about creation and evolution, but there's a lot of stuff there on dinosaurs and aliens and all sorts of other things. And, of course, we're appealing to everybody listening to send in questions, because you can answer a lot of questions that people could get answers for at Creation. But if somebody out there has a question, I'm pretty sure there's other people with the same question. And we'd love you to send them through to us, to our text line, just SMS 0401 949 949. Now, Dr. John, a couple of things that I know we have to talk about this week. One of them is the question from last week. It was, you stated post-flood ice age took 500 years. Now, how did the mammoths die with mouths full of food, if not snap frozen? And the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, as I mentioned to everybody that was listening about an hour ago, was a compelling new hypothesis that's in the Science Alert. They say it's a compelling new hypothesis, mind you. I'm not saying that. And it says could finally explain how the Earth formed. And that was with like all these millions of asteroids and meteors and big chunks of rock basically all just smashing into each other, but instead of exploding into lots of pieces, they all just stuck.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it, Mick, that they do have these theories, but yeah, well, we'll get on to some of that this afternoon. But good afternoon, Mick.
Yeah, good afternoon, Dr. John.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? It's hard to remember to say good afternoon, because for the benefit of our listeners who are not familiar, Mick and I have been doing these talks in Tuesday mornings for a few years.
Yes.
And getting used to the afternoon session. Are you used to it yet?
No. I'm getting there. But every now and again I let a morning, good morning, or something like to do with morning slip. Yes.
Yeah, well, I've been used to saying that. It was pretty hard to say good afternoon. But look, Mick, I wanted to start off this afternoon with a bit of sad news, actually. For those of our listeners who are already familiar with Creation Ministries, one of our former speakers, Dr. David Catchpool, died last week after quite a long illness. And David had worked in the Brisbane office until a few years ago when he had to quit because of ill health. But he was one of our most popular speakers. I used to love listening to David Catchpool. And I went up a couple of years ago to one that he did at Wyong Baptist Church. So there might be a few of our listeners who actually were at that that particular meeting. And he wrote a lot of articles on in Creation magazine. Very, very witty articles. He was the sort of bloke who had a flair for, a great expression. I loved listening to him, and he had a great sense of humour, and he was able to bring that into his talks. And it's such a shame that we're not going to be able to have him on this program, because we're getting other speakers on the program, and David would have been so good. People would have loved it. But he's another one, of our speakers who didn't grow up in a Christian home. He became a Christian later in life. And just like me, when he heard the creation message, everything fell into place. He realised that, the Bible could be trusted. It was true. And that really is a fantastic realisation. When you haven't heard that, you approach the Bible and you see how it talks about creation rather than evolution, and only a matter of thousands of years ago and not millions and billions. And it's very hard to get your head around that.
Yeah.
But once you hear the message that it's all explained by the history in Genesis and Noah's flood and whatever, when your eyes get open to that, that's the end of the penny section. You cannot not see it ever after that.
It's exciting for me to hear that, particularly when I hear it from you guys that are, doctors and PhDs and university graduates. You've been through that whole uni thing, and I know as a parent and having children going to uni and knowing what they're taught at university these days, there's a bit of a fear there. And then we see guys like you that have come out the other side going, okay, well, now we know what to look for. And all of a sudden it's, hey, the Bible is the most, it's more accurate than anything else we can see or have seen.
Well, that's right. I mean, I don't know about you, Mick, but I'm old enough to remember the days of black and white television.
Yes.
And, it's like the difference between black and white TV and colour TV. You know, once you see it, wow, I mean, it becomes just so obvious, and you could never go back to the other.
Yes.
I mean, there's no way anybody could convince me about evolution or long ages, because I've seen it, and it's like I say, once your eyes are opened, they never get closed again.
Yeah.
It's like once you become a Christian and you have a personal revelation of who Jesus really was and the existence of God, then you can't go back on it. I mean, I grew up as a Catholic, and I became an agnostic and then an atheist. But once I became a Christian, you could never go back to it. It's your eyes get opened and they never get closed. So really, I'm just sad to have seen David Catchpool go. He was a PhD in agricultural science and a very witty man. His articles are excellent, and any article by him that you come across in Creation magazine, worthwhile reading.
Well, I guess in some ways, though, we can feel jealous as well. He's in a better place than we are.
Yeah, well, he's jumped ship, hasn't he?
Yes, he's probably having a party right now, and look at us.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, we've been told to endure until the Lord comes, and that's what we're going to do.
Absolutely. It is 21 minutes past 4. You're on 94.9 with Dr. John and Mick, Creation Ministries International. He's answering the questions that you text through. SMS 0401 949 949. Now, Dr. John, one of the questions we got last week that we didn't fully finish, it was talking about, does the age of the earth really matter to Christianity? And is the Bible not about the rock of ages and less about the age of rocks? Can our view of the earth or creation undermine our belief?
Yeah, well, look, it's a great question, Mick. I mean, it's one that we commonly get. Is it important for Christians to believe this? And I want to spend a bit more time on that, because Creation Ministries is convinced about the truth of the Bible from the very first verse in Genesis, you know. And if you have a look at those first 11 chapters, what they do is they give the history of the world from creation right up to the time of Abraham. And that was about 2,000 years. Now, there wouldn't have been any writing around to record that, so it's been preserved through oral tradition through the first Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And we need to remember that Shem, who was Noah's son and a survivor of the ark, of the flood, he was still alive when Abraham was a boy. And so Abraham would have been able to get from his great-great-great-grandfather, all the history of the world right up until the time of the flood, and the history of the flood and what things were like after the flood, because Shem had seen it all. And that oral tradition was passed on then through the descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob to the children of Israel once they got into Egypt in the land of Canaan. In the land of Goshen. And the interesting thing is that Moses, as we know, was brought up by Pharaoh's daughter. Right, so he was brought up in the Egyptian Pharaoh's palace, and he had access to the wonderful libraries that the Egyptians had, and he was an educated man. So Moses knew all about writing and whatever. And so he was the one who God used to put that history of the world on paper.
Yep.
And so Moses wrote those first 5 books of the Bible, and they tell us that the world was created only about 6,000 years ago, and that original world was destroyed by the flood of Noah and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And the present world that we have, with all its geography and geological formations, they're all the leftovers of Noah's flood.
Yep.
You know, everything we see out there was formed by the flood. Now, as we mentioned last week, it was more than just 40 days and 40 nights of rain. I mean, it was that, and there was plenty of water coming from the sky, but most of the water would have been from volcanic and tectonic eruptions.
Yep.
You know, it came from underneath the earth. And those tectonic plates that we observe today, along with all the residual volcanoes and the Pacific Rim of Fire and the San Andreas Fault and all of those things, they're all leftovers of that flood.
Mm.
Now, obviously, the secular scientific world doesn't accept that history. Okay.
Yeah.
It developed a belief in a much more ancient Earth. You know, you mentioned earlier how there was that Big Bang and, you know, the rocks all started to congeal together. And, of course, they don't believe that the Earth has had a complete makeover.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they believe it's been around and going on that way for about 4.5 billion years. And so I want to talk a little bit about how they get those ages and where we believe they're not correct.
24 minutes to 5. And I'm with Dr. John right now. He's answering the questions that you sent through to our text line. Send your questions through to, or SMS 0401 949 949. And one of the questions that got sent through last week was, does the age of the earth really matter to Christianity? Is the Bible not about the rock of ages and less about the age of rocks? Can our view of the earth and creation undermine our belief? And I think we've mentioned before, Dr. John, that, you know, for a Christian, it's not going to cause you not to be a Christian. It's not really going to. There's nothing there that God will say, "Hey, I'm not going to accept you because of it." However, you have mentioned that it's more about when we're talking to people who aren't yet Christians, people who are asking the question, they're on the verge. You know, they're sort of, I guess, more concerned about the answer to some of these questions. And, of course, you know, those ages that we hear so much of on TV, I've got to ask as well, where do they really come from? But at the end of the day, it does matter to those people, right?
Well, yes, it does matter. And to answer the first bit of what you just asked then, Mick, where do the millions and billions of years come from? Well, they first of all started out just as opinion. They didn't have anything to back them up. But when the radiometric dating techniques and other sort of dating techniques came along, fortuitously for the long-age believers, they gave results that were consistent with millions and billions of years. Now, we'll talk about that on the program at some time too. Mm-hmm. But really, those techniques are full of flaws and uncertainties and assumptions and so on. And really, we don't believe that they're in the least bit reliable.
Mm-hmm.
But the second part of the question, does it matter? Yeah, it does really, because the Bible really depends on its for its believability on its total truth. You know, it's not a book where you can cherry pick what you want to believe. It stands or falls on its total truth. And if you can undermine that truth in one area, you cast doubt on the whole. And if the history of creation isn't true, mm-hmm. and if the earth isn't a young earth, then that casts doubt on the history of Jesus, and particularly, of course, the resurrection, which, I mean, that's the most unbelievable, if you like, thing. You know, people don't come back from the dead, mm-hmm. and yet we know that he did. And, of course, belief in Jesus and his resurrection is absolutely crucial for your salvation. So when you say that the age of the rocks doesn't matter, well, in and of itself it doesn't. But if it undermines the whole truth of the Bible, then it undermines the truth of the Jesus story as well. And that mightn't be a problem for Christians who don't have that truth undermined, but for people who are outside the church, yes, it does. And a lot of the researchers, there's a research organisation called Barna, and they find with young people in particular that the biggest block to them looking at the Bible or accepting Jesus is science. And by science, what they mean is the so-called scientific story of the age of the earth. You know, so really that's why it is absolutely crucial. And if Jesus is the only means of salvation and reconciliation, then of course he himself has to be totally trustworthy. And he definitely believed in the books of Moses and the history as we read it in Genesis, and so did his early disciples. And so our role really at Creation Ministries is to make sure we can look at the evidence and back up that belief. Because in 2 Corinthians 10:5, it tells us that our job is to demolish arguments and everything that raises itself against the true knowledge of God. So to undermine the consensus view of scientists, we've got to be able to meet them on their own terms, and we've got to understand the science as well and explain, particularly to Christians but to others, how when you actually do look at the scientific evidence, that it's absolutely consistent with what the Bible teaches and not what the world believes.
Yes. You are on 94.9. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. And Dr. John, last week we had a question in regards to the Ice Age. It took 500 years. So how did the mammoths die with mouths full of food, if not snap frozen? Good question from Perry, I thought.
Oh, yeah, no, it's a great question, Mick, and we'll get started on it today, but we'll probably have to continue a bit next week as well, because there's quite a bit to that. But, of course, it's something that's fascinated people for a very, very long time. Yep. And many of your listeners might be aware, some may not, that there are absolutely millions and millions of frozen mammoth carcasses all over the northern hemisphere. I mean, mostly Siberia, but northern Europe, Canada, and the US, and there's millions of these mammoth carcasses. And as our questioner said, some of them have been found with food in their mouths and stomachs, undigested food, and it looks as though they've been maybe snap frozen.
Yes.
Now, in actual fact, there probably only were a few that were snap frozen, because there are some that are very, very well preserved. The majority are not well preserved. You know, they're just bones, and a lot of those bones have been fragmented. But there are millions and millions of them, so there's an awful lot. And, of course, there's lots of other animals there as well, large animals like woolly rhinoceroses and various other things. And it really is something that has fascinated everybody, and they're looking to try and work out how it could possibly have happened.
Yep.
Because all of these animals were grazing animals.
Yep.
And they must have lived probably during the Ice Age, but south of the ice sheets. So they were in a grassland type area, and of course where they're found is nothing like that anymore. Yeah. You know, it's frozen tundra, and you know they're sort of in this. It's not exactly bog, but they're buried really, and so. It's nothing like what it is now. So how did it get to be that way? It's always been a puzzle to science, and people who want to read a really good article on it, there's been a recent one in Creation on the Creation website, and if people go to the search window and type in frozen mammoths or something like that, then they'll get that probably come up as the first article. So it's well worth a read. But what is it that caused them to get frozen like this? Now, we can say for sure that it has happened after the flood. Okay, we know the Ice Age came after the flood, but one of the other reasons we can say that is that the area that they're found, underneath that is sedimentary rock, which came from the flood. And of course, there's lots of mammoth drawings as cave art in the northern hemisphere. And as we've said on the program before, caves were formed in Noah's flood. So we know that they are post-flood, but how did they actually get to be the way they are? Now, some interesting things have come to light in recent years, so that we know that some of the earlier suggestions probably weren't right, because for the last 50 years or so, it's been known that elephants' digestive system is a little bit unusual. You know, elephants don't digest their food in their stomachs. So that's why there's undigested food there. They digest their food further on in their intestines. So we're probably going to have to continue that next week and explain how some of them were probably snap frozen, but the majority weren't, and what it is that they're buried in. So, listeners, stay tuned for next week. We'll continue on that question. It's a great question. Mammoths fascinate everybody. I mean, they are the iconic animal of the Ice Age. So yeah, it's well worth our while exploring that a bit further.
Absolutely. It's almost too long to wait. A week. I've got to wait a week before you can tell me about it. Sounds great. Hey, if you've got any questions that relate to any of this stuff that we've been talking about, or maybe other questions in regards to evolution or creation, send them through. Just text 0401 949 949. Thank you, Dr. John. Another awesome week, and I'm looking forward to next week.
Yeah, we'll continue on with the mammoths next week, Mick.
Absolutely. It is 9 minutes to 5. Good afternoon.